I was actually, in honor of Halloween month, I was actually thinking about doing a Dracula. Let us do the podcast.
This episode is sponsored by Front End Masters. They have a terrific lineup of live courses you can attend either online or in person. They also have a terrific backlog of courses you can watch, including JavaScript The Good Parts, Build Web Applications with Node.js, AngularJS in Depth, and Advanced JavaScript. You can go check them out at frontendmasters.com. This episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Every week on Hired, they run an auction where over 1,000 tech companies in San Francisco, New York, and LA bid on JavaScript developers, providing them with salary and equity up front. The average JavaScript developer gets an average of 5 to 15 introductory offers and an average salary of $130,000 a year. Users can either accept an offer and go right into interviewing with the company or deny them without any continuing obligations. It's totally free for users, and when you're hired, they give you a $2,000 bonus as a thank you for using them. But if you use the JavaScript Jabber link, you'll get a $4,000 bonus instead. Finally, if you're not looking for a job but know someone who is, you can refer them to Hired and get a $1,337 bonus if they accept the job. Go sign up at hired.com/JavaScriptJabber. This episode is sponsored by Wijmo5, a brand new generation of JavaScript controls. A pretty amazing line of HTML5 and JavaScript products for enterprise application development in that Wijmo5 leverages ECMAScript 5 and each control ships with AngularJS directives. Check out the faster, lighter, and more mobile Wijmo5. This episode is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is the provider I use to host all of my creations. All the shows are hosted there, along with any other projects I come up with. Their user interface is simple and easy to use, their support is excellent, and their VPSs are backed on solid-state drives and are fast and responsive. Check them out at DigitalOcean.com. If you use the code JavaScript Jabber, you'll get a $10 credit. This episode is brought to you by Braintree. If you're a developer or manager of a mobile app and searching for the right payments API, check out Braintree. Braintree's new V0 SDK makes it easy to support multiple mobile payment types with one simple integration. To learn more and to try out their sandbox, go to braintreepayments.com/JavaScriptJabber. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 181 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have Amy Knight.
Hello.
Dave Smith. Jameson Dance.
Hey, friends.
Joe Eames.
Hey, everybody.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Just want to do a quick shout-out. I just launched the JS Remote Conf website, so if you are interested in attending that conference, go to jsremoteconf.com. You can use the code JABBER to get 25% off.
Another thing to point out is nobody else laughed except Joe at Dave's. Like, we have stone faces. We're professionals.
Yeah, that's
you have no
right.
idea how hard that was.
Or you have no sense of humor.
I just didn't get to my unmute fast enough.
Yeah, it's almost like he made a cat joke. We have two guests today. We have Andrew Clark.
Hi, everyone.
And Dan Abramov.
Hi.
Do you want to introduce yourselves quickly? I know, Dan, you were on a couple of weeks ago, but...
Sure. I'm Andrew Clark. I work at a company called OpenGov. I've been doing web development for about like a year and a half. And I was the creator of a Flux library called flummox, and I have a few other libraries, and I help out Dan on Redux.
Yeah, so my name is Dan, and I'm mostly visible in React ecosystem. I started doing JavaScript a few years ago, and I'm known as creator of React Loader, the hot-reloading thing for React, and Redux, which is a take on Flux, but it's not exactly Flux.
All right, well, I don't even know where to start, so somebody else help me out.
We talked a little bit about Redux a couple of episodes ago, but I don't think we ever sat down and talked about Flux. And Flux is kind of a more broader idea. Can one of you give us an explanation of what Flux is?
Flux is a solution for doing data management in a JavaScript application. It was released in May of 2014 by the folks at Facebook as kind of an accompaniment to the React library. React is kind of unique from these other libraries like Ember and Angular, and that doesn't really have a built-in solution for doing data management. Like typically you use Model View Controller and Model View View, some kind of system like that. It's really an alternative to one of those types of systems. And in a way, you can think of it as an inversion of MVC. Whereas in MVC, you have these views that will update these models directly. And Flux is a little bit of inversion. where the stores update themselves. They broadcast a change event, and then the views reflect whatever state the stores are currently in. And all the data goes in a unidirectional flow. So it goes really well with the unidirectional data flow that in the React model. It's not necessarily tied to React, but effectively it is kind of the unofficial way to do data management in React applications.
For people that aren't familiar with it still, do you think there's any benefit in explaining it by contrasting it with MVC? Or do you think that it's just too different? I've heard some people kind of explain it in those terms, and it, for people who've only done MVC, sort of helps a little.
Yeah, so I come from an interesting point of view because I actually haven't done that much application development before I did application development with React. I made an iOS app, so I was familiar with MVC that way. It's probably not, if you're coming from it without any knowledge of Flux at all, I don't think it's all that helpful to contrast to MVC. I would maybe just think of it as kind of an extension of the unidirectional flow of React. So if you're familiar with the way data flows in a React app, where things start at the top component and flow down as props to down the component tree, this is just kind of an extension of that flow, where if you need to store data in kind of an external system that's not just local to a component, that's kind of the best way for me to think about it. There's some charts out there, which personally I think are a little bit confusing, but you'll see there are basically three main parts. There's the dispatcher, and we'll talk about dispatcher and it's, for instance, Redux doesn't have a dispatcher, but if we're talking about Flux in general, usually there's a dispatcher, there are stores, and there are views. And those are the three main kind of areas of a Flux application. And then you have these things called actions, which are, if we're going to compare it back to MVC again, those are basically like events. And all these events flow through the dispatcher, go to the stores, which go to and then the views update with the stores. And it just goes in this kind of circular unidirectional flow. I'm just realizing now it's kind of hard to explain unless you actually looking at it. Dan, do you have a better way of explaining it?
I would just add that I don't fully agree that it doesn't make sense to compare Flux with MVC, because actually when I explain Flux to people, I usually compare it with MVC. And the way I compare it is that I explain what Flux doesn't have. And this kind of helps people get up to speed with it. And so what I say is that Flux does not have models. Because in a way, yes, you have stores, and they are kind of like models, but they don't have setters, right? You can't set things. You can't modify them from outside. And this is big important thing about Flux. And another important thing is that you don't have a bunch of objects that you call methods on. Like in MVC, you have models, and you are usually they're like active records. They have some methods, you call them, and they modify the state. But you don't have that in Flux. So this is one thing that falls apart. And another important aspect of Flux is that it doesn't have different kinds of change events. So normally in any MVC application, you have this field changed, this other field changed, and they are all different events. But in Flux, you've got just one change event. There are no other change events. So that's kind of what helps people understand some aspects of Flux architecture if they come from MVC.
That's a good way of putting it is, stores don't have direct setters. Another thing that really helped me was when you think about how a view reacts to a store update. The store updates, it receives an action, it updates themselves, and it emits a single change event. It doesn't have like different levels of granularity for those change events. It basically just broadcasts to the world, hey, I've changed, and then the views just reactively, they always reflect whatever the truth is inside the store.
That's the reason, sorry for interrupting you.
No
I just want to say that that's the reason why Flux did not exist before React, because we didn't have a view framework that can just update the view just to reflect some model. You always had to do something, you had to specify the change. Yeah.
All right, so I heard a couple of things that I want to go back to and talk about that you guys said. So, Andrew, you had said when you were talking about Flux and the one-way data flow, you compared it, you said it's a natural extension of React's flow from the top-level component down through the bottom-level components as data flows from that top-level component and down.
Mm-hmm.
which I find to be a very interesting statement as talking about that as the one-way data flow. Every time I talk to people about one-way data flows versus two-way data flows, it's not so much, the components are kind of also a representation of the DOM tree. So it's not a matter of where it flows in relationship to the DOM, it's where it flows from changes to your model through rendering, then into the DOM versus top of the DOM going on down. So I find that to be an interesting view, one that I've never heard anybody take before. So I don't know, is that just my ignorance?
Well, do you mind asking, do you use React often, or which framework are you usually using?
Well, I'm far more experienced with Angular than with React.
Okay, well, in React at least, I don't really have that much Angular experience, but in React at least, the main way that when you're talking about just the view part or the component layer, when you're passing information from a component to another component, the only way to do that in React, well, there's this big asterisk here, but we'll call context, but we'll ignore it. The only way to do that in React is via props, which are analogous to like attributes on a DOM node, like you'd write in HTML. The only way to pass information is via these props, and they can only go one direction. You pass a prop from the owner node down to its children inside the render method. That is the only way to pass things. It's a really nice part about React because it makes everything very predictable, and it means when you're looking at a component, you always know exactly where all the data is coming from because it can only come from its props. And you always know where it's passing data to because you're passing it via the props to its children. If you ever want to mimic any kind of two-way data binding, in React, what you have to do is you have to do things like pass a callback down to the child, and then the child will call that callback, and that allows the parent to access some new information. So, for instance, that's how you implement an input field or a form in React, is you have to pass these callbacks, these change handlers down to its children. So if you're just first learning React, that's a little bit different than how some other frameworks have done it in the past, where you'd have two-way data binding. And there is a little bit more, I guess, boilerplate involved, or that might be the wrong word, but there is a little bit more steps that you have to do to get that to happen. But that's the essence of unidirectional data flow, is that data always flows from the top down to the bottom. Flux gives you a way to kind of extend that looping model where rather than passing a callback to the child, if you're using Flux, you can fire off an action which goes to the dispatcher, which is completely separate from the component tree, and then the dispatcher sends it to the stores, and then the stores go back to the view. It just makes that loop a little bit bigger and allows you to do things that aren't mapped so tightly to the component tree. Sometimes data doesn't necessarily need to flow in the form of that tree.
Well, I find it interesting that you consider the flow of the data through the DOM to be the salient point here. As I see and read and discourse with people about this topic, it seems to be that the focus is on the data flow through its changes and not necessarily through the DOM. So, for example, when you say React has a one-way data flow from top to bottom in the DOM, yes, it does, but I don't consider that to make it what most people would consider to be the one-way data flow. One-way data flow, as I see it, is a matter of I've made changes to the data. Now I've got to completely render that out, and I can't, during rendering, make other further changes to the data. And that's...
Well, you're correct, and I don't think that's wrong. I don't know if necessarily if we even disagree here. I will just say that I would make a distinction between the component tree and the DOM tree, because at least personally, I've stopped thinking of my React components as just they don't necessarily always map to a DOM node, right? They're just ways of encapsulating different parts of the application.
Yeah, normally you have DOM nodes at the leaf part of the tree. So most of your app you express as components, passing props to other components, and DOM is at the very bottom of that.
Right.
This might be a good time to introduce this article you shared with us before the show called Why FluxComponent is Greater Than FluxMixin, because I think this is some of the context where you're coming from, right, Andrew?
Yeah, and there's another one right next to that Dan wrote called, what was it called again, Dan? It was...
Mixins are dead.
Yeah, Mixins are dead, long-lived composition. And this is an important concept. We're kind of getting away from Flux here a little bit, but this is an important concept in React, in that the primary way of scaling your React app, the primary pattern that you use is composition, not mixins or inheritance or anything like that. So that's why maybe there's some confusion about the term unidirectional data flow, is you have to think about data passing down through these components. So that article I wrote, Why FluxComponent is Better Than FluxMixin, it's kind of a weird title. It was specifically a document that I wrote for my library called flummox. And this was back in a time when there's this explosion of Flux libraries, since Facebook never really released an official Flux framework. And a lot of them were coming up with solutions for how to integrate with your React components in a not, terribly repetitive way. Because what people were doing before these frameworks was they would just manually subscribe to, these events, and they would use these lifecycle hooks and call set state, and it was just a lot of boilerplate. So these libraries started coming out with these mixins that you could apply to your React components to kind of do all that stuff for you. And around the time I wrote this article, I was realizing, with React, you don't really want to use these mixins. It's much nicer if you can use a component-based interface for describing how to subscribe to store updates. So this was an article just showing how mixins, they're very popular in other types of libraries, and people might feel comforted by them. But if you're going to use React and take full advantage of the React component architecture, you want to use components whenever possible in preference to mixins. This is also related to another link that I put in that document describing what higher order components are. Another very important concept in React, especially recently, where rather than using mixins, you describe these functions that will return a component. And that way, all of your abstractions are just based around components and rather than having to inherit from all these different things using mixins.
Sorry, if I could just interrupt for a very quick statement, I want to say that just to clarify about the top-down data flow, the important part is that in React, any kind of state is owned by some component. So if there is an input state, it needs to be stored in some component, either this component or some component of the tree, and only this component can change it. So with Flux, what happens is that we store that state somewhere outside of component, and we need an entry point for that in component tree. So this is what this FluxComponent does. And previously, people used Mixins to make other components in their application these entry points for data, for sideways data from Flux store.
So do you guys consider the flow of data from a top-level component down through child components to be what people are the key point of one-way data flow versus the flow of data through like Flux, through action creators, dispatchers, stores, and then into render?
Yeah, so basically what I think happens is that you can just both are one-way data flow, but with Flux, you add more predictability to it because instead of having some root component that updates the state in response to callbacks, you move that logic into a separate place outside the component, and you describe every mutation as an object, as an action. So it is possible to record and replay them, for example, or to log every mutation, and that would be harder with callbacks. So Flux is just making this pattern more predictable.
So do you consider Flux to be basically an extension of how React by itself as a Vue library works, or is Flux an entire React by itself is one-way data flow, and Flux just canonizes it a bit more, adds a little bit more ceremony and structure to it, or is it are they entirely two separate things? I don't know if that question makes sense to you.
I think I see what you mean. If you look at the websites for either React or Flux, they're going to talk a lot about unidirectional data flow. And they're slightly different in that in React, it is very component specific when it's talking about where the data flows. But I don't think it's all that different, at least in my head when I'm modeling it in my head. To me, it's an extension of the entire flow of data as it moves throughout your application. The data moves from, an owner component down to its children, and then a children might fire an action, and then the action goes to the dispatcher, then to the store, and then back to the component. To me, it's all part of the same unidirectional data flow. I don't see them as two separate things.
You kind of see React by itself as sort of a mini Flux?
Well, I wouldn't say that.
I would add that if you saw recent tweets by Sebastian Markbåge, who is like one of the masterminds behind React, I think he's a little disappointed with everyone having to use Flux, and he sees it as a shortcoming of React state model. So perhaps in the future, React will... Sebastian Markbåge.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce his surname, so...
I think that's right. I put that tweet in that document as well.
Yeah.
So, Joe, I think I know where you're coming from with this, because basically when React came out, but before Flux was really being talked about, no one really talked about one-way data flow. That wasn't really in the vernacular that I observed anyway. And so Flux came out and everyone started talking about one-way data flow and how it was great and stuff. Now, one thing that people did say early on with React was two-way binding is not part of React. And so it's all one-way binding. So you would hear that. But one-way data flow, the term really came out when Flux came out. And what I've been seeing is that the concept of one-way data flow has leaked out of Flux and back into your component architecture in React applications themselves. And it really permeates every part of the app, not just how you pass data between dispatchers and stores and views, but also how your components themselves receive their data and send data around is all one way as well. So I think that's probably why you're wondering, because you haven't really heard it in the context of the React component model itself. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Well, and another piece of this is the idea of one-way data flows in a simple explanation that makes sense to people that haven't been dealing with React is challenging, to say the least. And I deal with a lot of people who work with Angular and trying to explain to them what the difference is, what one-way data flow truly is and how it's different. But in my mind, I'm always thinking about the circle. I've got experience with Elm as well as Angular and a little bit with React. In my mind, it's always the circle of a change moves over to some, action creator, dispatcher, store, or whatever the flow is based on the framework you're using. If it's Redux, it's different. You got reducers. If it's Elm, it's different. But that flow of data. So I'm trying to explain that, and that's actually a fairly difficult concept to explain to somebody that's never, Dave Smith, you actually had the most awesome slide at React Rally explaining your version of Flux in your sprinkler system.
Oh boy.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to talk about that.
You mean where I just deleted 80% of the boxes and said, this is what I do?
Yeah, where it's like, Flux is not a library, it's a pattern. And I don't know, you had an interesting way of pointing out your impressions of Flux.
And if anybody hasn't seen that talk, you must see that talk. The best talk this year.
You should ask the React Rally organizers when it's going to be posted online.
Soon.
Anyway, that if you do see that talk, it might even be out by the time you get this. I don't know. No pressure, Jameson. But basically, you got to keep in mind, it was a joke. The whole talk was a joke. So that's all I'm going to say about it. Anyway,
I think there's a kernel of truth in some jokes, though. Like, my impression of the talk was really, really funny, but I think there's some truth to your like implicit criticism that Flux can seem like just a bag of words. And like, if you have done MVC for a long time, there's a really explicit place to put everything. And you have a lot of ingrained training. And when
even
you take that,
agrees, right?
Yeah, I guess the explicit place is like where the framework that you use says to put it. But with Flux, there's so many different frameworks that even though they share common ideas, I still found for a long time, like I would sit down to write an app and be like, but how? I've read that diagram 1,000 times. I see the little square that it makes. And like, what code do I actually type to make it work?
Yeah. So Dan and Andrew, what do you say to people when they say, I just can't get this in my head? I'm having a hard time conceptualizing.
Well, I totally agree with everything you just said. I remember the first React app I ever made, it's also the first Flux app I ever made, was terrible. It was the worst code ever. I shuddered to, the app ended up being not so bad, but the awful. And it almost made me not want to do React. I liked React itself so much that I kept pushing forward, but I agree. And I think one of the reasons why there have been so many Flux frameworks, just an explosion of libraries. Every day there's a new pun on Flux and a new library to go along with it. I think one of the reasons is just that it is just like a bag of concepts, and there wasn't a lot of clarity over how to put all of these ideas into a coherent framework.
Nobody was sure what's important and what's not.
Right. If you look back, there was a talk at ReactConf in February where Bill Fisher, I believe he was the moderator. He's one of the the creators of Flux. He had a panel with like 6 or 7 people from different companies. Some of them were different people from internal to Facebook. And each person was describing how they do Flux on their team. And they were just totally different. Everybody had a different way of doing it. Some people were doing data fetching inside of the stores. Some people were saying that we don't do that at all. We do all data fetching in the action creators. So I remember watching that and going, this is kind of bananas. That was kind of one of the motivations behind when I made this Flux library called flummox was I was trying to distill down all of these weird, crazy concepts and find, okay, what's actually important? What can we get rid of? What can we abstract away from the user? And just try and find an API and a library that kind got rid of all this extraneous stuff and really focused on what was actually important. So I think I got pretty close with flummox, made some mistakes. Redux, I don't know how much you guys talked about Redux with Dan on the last podcast, but I think Redux is kind of, if you notice, there haven't been that many Flux frameworks since Redux. I jokingly call it the Flux framework to end Flux frameworks. I really think it's the last one of this family that I can foresee existing. The next library that replaces whatever is going to be something substantially different, I think, because I really do think that Redux is the essence of what we were searching for that year and a half with all the upstarts and the different failed libraries and all of that.
Yeah, so you think we'll see a convergence on Redux?
I think there already has been. Dan, don't you think so?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, of course, it doesn't do things like Relay does, but that wasn't the point. But for what it can do, what most Flux libraries can do, yeah, I think there has been some convergence. I'm actually super surprised by it because I didn't expect that to happen. I only did this library for my talk, and it was growing like crazy.
Yeah, so if anyone who's learning Flux today, if you want to learn Flux, don't read about the dispatcher. Don't look at those diagrams with all the 50 boxes on it. Just go read the Redux docs, because that explains to you what's actually important about Flux and what is actually valuable about it without kind of confusing you with a bunch of concepts which either are irrelevant now, like the dispatcher, or just are kind of a distraction.
So this actually closely relates to a question I had. I read an article or a blog post that somebody wrote about Flux, and they kind of talked through the lessons that they learned. And they said as they first learned Flux, a couple of big questions immediately came up at them as they started trying to write a real production app. And they were things, the two examples I can think of off the top of my head was, can stores make AJAX calls, and can dispatchers access state? And I'm pretty sure I got the questions right, but even if I don't exactly have them right. Does Redux eliminate some of this ambiguity that exists in Flux?
Yes, it does. It's interesting because Redux limits you in a way because it removes the dispatcher and prevents you from making it just totally prevents you from making manual updates to the store because you don't really have access to the store. You express everything in terms of these reducer functions, which, if you don't know what that is, it's the function that takes a previous value, or it takes an accumulated value and a new value, and it returns a new accumulated value. If you do array.reduce, then you know what a reducing function is. So because it imposes those kinds of limits on you, it's impossible to do an AJAX call from a store. You just can't. There's no way to do it in Redux. You have to do it, and there is no dispatcher, so you can't access state from the dispatcher. You have to do it in an action creator or into something that is dispatching an action. So that's a really beautiful thing about Redux, is it removes these kind of questions in your head. You're like, oh, I can't do that. So, and it guides you toward a solution that will probably lead to better success.
So are you guys aware, besides just the democratic process, of anyone who's trying to close what I would call a documentation gap on Flux? Because right now we have lots of competing libraries. I mean, you yourselves just said, if you use Flux, just ignore these parts of the documentation. You'll be great. Is anybody working on this problem to say, you know what, we need not necessarily like a grand unified Flux, but something so that people can jump into Flux and actually do it right and have success without having to trim parts of documentation or just know people who know the right things.
Well, that's why we made Redux, right? It has the documentation, a lot of it.
Yeah, it has excellent documentation.
I really tried to, when I was working on the docs for Redux, I really tried to not just describe the API because the API is small. I wanted to dive into some specific questions that pop up in your head as you try to implement a Flux application. So if you go through Redux docs, you have a pretty good idea of what to do and what not to do.
Yeah, and another thing I'll say is that when I said earlier that just ignore these parts of the docs, I don't mean that because just don't worry about it, it'll take care of itself. It's more that, Redux has shown that a lot of these concepts that were thrown around at the beginning about the dispatcher, and all this other crazy stuff, it's not necessary. When you use Redux, it's not that you're just ignoring the dispatcher. There literally is no dispatcher. So if you go through, and I know we might be a little myopic here, but I really do think that if you read through the Redux docs, there's tons of really cool example projects around it too. You'll get a full view of Flux, even if you don't necessarily learn about the dispatcher, because we've learned at this point that you don't really need a dispatcher. It's not necessary. We can talk about why, but that's kind of a relic. We don't need that anymore.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, because I always have to put this disclaimer, is that Redux architecture is a really similar, except for some parts, to Elm architecture. And this is kind of the tricky part, because when I was initially working on Redux, I think I've read Elm architecture document, but I didn't fully understand it because of the Elm syntax, and the first version of Redux was not quite like Elm architecture. But later, actually, Andrew Clark wrote a gist explaining how I don't need the dispatcher, and that I can do reducer composition to the full, and now Redux architecture is a lot similar to Elm. So if you're interested in how to make really cool abstractions with it, really cool reusable parts, then you should read Elm architecture document, even if you don't understand Elm, because that's just a huge learning experience.
So I'd like to get your thoughts on Elm.
I actually haven't used it. I mean, I've meant to use it for so many times. I even installed it, but I was always distracted by some issues or pull requests, and I never got around to actually fooling around with it. But I really like the architecture and the libraries for it. For example, the Redux undo library, which lets you implement easily undo redo for your Redux reducers, was inspired by Elm to undo redo library. So there's a lot of cool stuff there. Even if you don't plan to use it, you should check it out.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. I think Elm is super cool. I haven't actually used it though. Kind of hard to find I need to find like a side project or something, because I can't exactly use it at work. I think it's really exciting. I've never really used a fully functional language like Clojure or something like that for any kind of significant project. I've always just kind of dabbled in it. Most of my functional programming experience, or if you can call it that, has honestly just been like writing Redux code or writing pseudo functional code in JavaScript. But Elm is basically exactly like in the area of the type of language I would want to use if I got to choose today.
Yeah, I think there is a kind of point in JavaScript where you kind of start to feel weird about writing too functional code, and you back off. So Redux is like Elm architecture until the point where it gets kind of weird in JavaScript.
You can't do everything that Elm can do in JavaScript alone, because you don't have, types. You don't have these guarantees that Elm has that makes the experience, go to the next level. So there's a limit to what you can do functional programming wise in just JavaScript. But I think Redux gets a lot of that stuff. It gets you really close without actually 100% getting you there.
So we touched on this issue a little bit of kind of making patterns explicit in frameworks, where the ideas of Flux were out there and people were talking about them, and everyone kind of had a different approach to how they did it in practice. I was watching this talk that Tom Dale did at TXJS, and he was talking about Ember, obviously, but one of the things that he mentioned was that Ember tries really hard to make things really clear to developers, where this is how you do a certain thing. And that they believe that developers are more productive when they're not figuring out how to do these basic underlying architectural things. They just want to build stuff, So if you have to invent your own framework for managing data, that's time you're not spending working on features or refactoring code or writing tests or whatever. It seems like the approach in the React land is kind of the opposite, where it's like, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Do you think that's a weakness of the React community, or is it just a trade-off?
It's just too early. I mean, React has changed how we interact with the DOM. So obviously, other things like interacting with data are going to change too. And we haven't completely figured it out yet. So it's normal. It's just age thing. I come back in 5 years and it'll be already.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is, if you want to, there are two ways to accomplish. I haven't seen that talk, by the way, by Tom Dale, but it's definitely true that React and Ember are kind of.
It's a really good talk. You should check it out.
I'll definitely check it out. It's definitely true that Ember and React sit at opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of telling developers how to accomplish things. But I think if your goal is making things straightforward and simple for the developer, there's two ways to do that. One is to have a bunch of conventions and frameworks and libraries and API calls for how to do very specific things. That might be an exaggeration. I'm not saying that's exactly what Ember does. So just solving it by adding more API and more conventions. And the other way to do it is just to make your API really, really simple and straightforward and finding the right abstractions to problems and letting people build on top of that. So there's a really cool talk, and I know Dan's a favor of this talk too, that Sebastian Markbåge gave at, I think it was like...
Minimal API Surface.
Yeah, it's called Minimal API Surface Area. I think that's the title of it. I can't remember what conference it's from. Where he talks about how the React team has really taken kind of an opposite approach where they try and get rid of APIs. They try and simplify APIs and get rid of the ones that aren't working and try and find the most ideal, smallest API surface area possible. One example of this is, they haven't gotten rid of React.create class, but they're de-emphasizing it more recently. They haven't gotten rid of Mixins, but they're pushing higher order components, which is really just a function that returns a component, so it's not really a new API. They're pushing that as a pattern instead of Mixins. They're making things simpler as they get toward 1.0 rather than adding more and more cruft. It makes some things, does mean that maybe sometimes you have to do a little bit more extra work yourself, but it also allows the right abstractions to emerge in the community, and it makes it easier for people to innovate on top of a really solid core with projects like React Router or Redux or what have you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and this is a common sentiment, that React forces you to actually learn JavaScript. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing towards Ember or Angular, because that's not what I mean. But I think React actually forced me to properly learn JavaScript, because I don't have these million convenient APIs I can call like jQuery, but I have to actually structure my application and think about it. But once I get past this stage, I feel much more powerful. So it's like React teaches you how to fish instead of giving you the fish, if it makes sense.
Now you just made me hungry.
This is more for people who, I guess, are like first trying to get started with React and Flux. Everyone talks about React and Flux being more functional, and it is more functional, but you can still use ES6 classes in it. So we kind of talked about this a little bit, but for people getting started, would you advise they try to stick to, as much functional concepts as possible, or start with classes?
I would tell people to use classes, but I might be wrong. We have some new team members on my team right now, and I don't know if you know this, but in the next version of React, there's a release candidate out now. You can actually just use the stateless. I'm sure you guys talked about this in the last podcast, but you can use just pure function stateless components, which don't even have classes. It's just a function that maps some props to React elements. In the code I've been writing and the code I've been pushing some of my teammates to write, I try and write everything with those pure function components. And if I need to use set state, or if I need to use a lifecycle method, for instance, because that's another reason you want to use a class, I try and extract that into a higher order component and then wrap my pure function with it. This goes back to this idea of separating between dumb components and smart components. Dan wrote a really good article about that. It's a concept in React where you try and put your stateful stuff and your a lot of your logic inside of your smart components, and then those components just render these dumb components, which really just are about, they're your leaf nodes. They're just rendering straight to the DOM. So yeah, I try my best to avoid ever using set state or classes or lifecycle hooks. And the cases where I do need to use them, I try and write some sort of abstraction around it and use higher order components. Dan, what about you?
Yeah, if I can clarify this a little bit, I would say that I do use classes, but only for React components when I need lifecycle methods and stuff like that. You can't really get around it right now. There are proposals for classless module-style components, but these are just proposals. You can find them in a React feature repo. You should Google it. It's really cool. There is all sorts of stuff that will probably never see the light of day, but it's really interesting to read about. But if you're talking about should I use classes in my regular JavaScript code? I would say no. I haven't written a class for ages, and I feel just fine, and I feel better than if I was using classes. So, classes are often requested feature in JavaScript. Okay, we have it, but I don't really think it buys me much in terms of application logic, because my models are plain objects. My transformations of models are pure functions. So the only use for classes I have is for React components that have lifecycle methods. And I don't think it's evil to use class in this case, because you're not actually creating them or doing something with them. It's just a way to express a component that has lifecycle hooks. So I don't think it's a problem to use class in this case. I don't really understand why people go to extra lengths to avoid using classes in this case. I think it's fine. Just don't use inheritance, don't create class hierarchies. That's the biggest problem with classes.
And one more thing I'll say is that I don't use classes in my normal JavaScript either anymore, but I think when you're using React, one of the weird, kind of more awkward things about it is you've got this functionally inspired library, but then you've got this object-oriented state API with set state, and you've got this kind of littered everywhere. Sometimes it does feel like a little bit of an amalgam of two separate, it feels like this weird marriage between two conflicting ideas. I think part of that, if you listen to the React authors and maintainers, is just them compromising and realizing that in the interest of friendliness to the wider JavaScript community, they've made a few compromises and given a more friendly object-oriented API in some cases to everybody. But I think going forward in the future, you're going to see you'll probably see this kind of awkward object-oriented APIs shed, and we'll get to a more functional future. The biggest example of that so far is Mixins are now not favored anymore in favor of using composition and higher order components. And I think that if you look at that React Future repo, we're only going to go more and more in that direction.
Yeah, I think in many ways, sorry for interrupting you. I just want to say in many ways, it's like React is like a Trojan horse for functional programming in JavaScript.
Yes, exactly. And that's interesting because I know that when Redux was like kind of young, we had a lot of discussions on GitHub and elsewhere talking about how far do we go with these functional concepts? Are we going to scare everybody off? If we use reducers instead of stores, and at one point, what we now call reducers, we were calling stores just for friendliness for people who are used to other Flux libraries. And eventually, I think for the most part, we realized, hey, we're just going to call it, we're going to use whatever API feels most natural to us, and people will pick up if we document it well and explain it well, and it's a good API. And it's worked out really well for Redux. And I think as React moves in that same kind of functional direction, people are going to pick up on it fast, and it's going to make them better programmers. It's made me a better programmer as I've thought about this stuff with Redux.
Amy, what were you saying?
Oh, I was just going to say, I agree. I have not done very much with React, but with what I do on the front end with Angular, I don't know. I think I was excited to see classes in JavaScript, but the more that I've dealt with them in ES6, the more they're really not that great.
It is better than if you're going to like manually copy things over to like an object prototype and do all that type of stuff. So it is better than something, but it's not better, in my opinion, than just going full, just using functions and using proof functions whenever possible.
Yeah, I agree.
At least they're classy.
Somebody had to go there, right?
So, the future of Flux. No, wait. Where Flux falls short. Let's talk about that. In what ways do you guys think Flux is weak?
Okay, so I wrote a few things down. I think Flux so I've written several Flux apps now. I've written 2 apps, or 1.5, I guess, because we're still in the middle of another one. I've written 2 apps in Redux. I wrote that really terrible, horrible initial, that first app I wrote with like just the normal, trying to make my own Flux library solution. So I've made a bunch of Flux apps, and what I've found, even with Redux, is that it's really good at synchronous stuff, but async stuff can still get pretty messy unless you go full reactive and you start using something like RxJS. Just because async stuff is just inherently more complex. Data fetching with Flux which is what a lot of people use it for. It's good. It's way better in Redux than it ever was in FluxMixin or any other library I used. But it's still very imperative and complex. I'm at a point now where when I'm working on an app, most of my time debugging or, trying to figure out a problem with my code is not spent in React itself. I'm at the point now where React does basically exactly what I want it to. I rarely am confused by React itself. It's always something with data fetching or caching or pagination or something like that. So even with a really good Flux app, data fetching is still pretty complex. And there are other solutions that out there, maybe they are yet to exist, that I think can do data fetching and async stuff in general in a much better way. The other point, which Dan brought up earlier, was that the one downside to moving some of your state into these global-ish Flux stores is that now your state isn't if you're putting component state inside of a Flux store, now you got your state in like two separate places, and maybe you've got like three different files, like an action creators file and a store file and a component file, and it just makes it a lot harder to follow what's going on. I noticed that we kind of went overboard in this current project we're doing with moving stuff into reducers and into Redux, where sometimes set state is a little gross, but it is a lot more convenient when you're just trying to get a feature to work than having to make like three separate files. So that's what I believe Sebastian Markbåge was talking about on Twitter. As part of it is just exposing a failure of React right now. Maybe not a failure of React, that's really harsh, but maybe a shortcoming of React right now, where the state model or the state architecture could be a little bit better.
If I can add, my complaint about the original Flux is that it's so hard to reuse the store logic across different stores. So, for example, if you have pagination and you have 10 different stores that all want to paginate, but in response to different actions, and they have some kind of optimistic updates that are unique to each store, it's really hard to reuse that logic. I have a project called Flux, React Router example, and it has pagination there, and I think nobody really understands what's happening there, and I don't understand either. So this is something that I wanted to solve in Redux, and I think it actually provides a good solution in terms of you have these reducers, which are just functions, and that means that you can create functions that create functions. And there was an example in Redux called Real World example that shows how you can create a reducer factory. Sorry for using the word factory. How you can create a reducer factory that implements pagination and then reuse it in different places of your reducer tree. So some things that were harder to reuse in Flux, they can actually be libraries in Redux. Another example is undo redo, which is there is a library called Redux Undo, which works with any Redux application. You just plug it in and you have undo redo for free. So this is something that was bugging me in the original Flux, but I think Redux solves it. But I agree that async is brittle, it's kind of hard to do, which is why Redux actually doesn't have any async solution. You are supposed to do it yourself. And I think if you have complex async APIs and complex async dependencies, you should use something like Rx, or I've seen James Long's using channels. You just use whatever abstraction that makes sense for you and you feed it into Redux. And this is why Redux has a concept of middleware, which is your custom stuff that runs between dispatching an action and the time where action comes into Reducer.
Yeah, that's another really nice thing about Redux, and it's highly extensible just because everything is a pure function. So it's really easy to compose functions and to create functions that return other functions, as Dan said. And the evidence for that being an effective approach is in just how many, there are just so many Redux third-party or userland Redux extensions out there. Is really cool.
But I wanted to add that, of course, another really big problem with Flux and Redux is the lack of declarative data fetching, which is exactly what Relay says to solve. So anytime you move a component that depends on some data across the component tree somewhere else, you have to change all these places where you call action creators to actually fetch the data. And this was the biggest issue for me with Flux, I think, because it was just so frustrating to change that all the time and to avoid underfetching and overfetching. But it depends on your app, because if you make something as complex as Facebook, yeah, definitely you need declarative data fetching. But if your app is relatively simple, or if you don't rely on servers much and most of your mutations are local, like a complex post editor or whatever, then probably Redux is not such a bad idea.
Yeah, and actually at OpenGov right now, we're working on a new app, and we're only like 2.5 sprints into it. We started full Redux, but now it's like a medium-ish sized app. And I don't mean the website medium, I just mean the size medium.
No, thanks for the clarification.
Sorry. I noticed that immediately. Yeah, so it's a moderately, how about that? It's a moderately sized app, but
not to be confused with moderately.com, but go ahead.
Right. Okay. So it's an app that's a little bit bigger than small. And we already have like tons of action creators and reducers, and Redux has worked out really well so far, but we've been experimenting with using something like Relay or maybe Falcor for doing just the data fetching part. So I've been working on that this sprint. And right now we're in like this hybrid Redux and Relay state, and it's actually working really well. Relay's really good at data fetching. There are a few areas of our app where we're doing some complex local stuff that you can't really use Relay for, at least for right now. And Redux is working really well there. And I mean, the nice thing about React is it's really easy to mix and match these types of approaches for different parts of the application because everything is nice and organized into these components. So I'm really excited about the potential for Relay, but we haven't abandoned Redux by any means.
I really wonder what a legacy React code is going to look in 5 years. Like, are we going to look at the mess we wrote and think like, oh my God, that was horrible?
I look at what I wrote yesterday and I think, oh my God, that's horrible. So,
I mean, think of your Backbone code today, right? Backbone code now is probably legacy code.
We hope. We can only hope that our code today, 5 years from now, it looks terrible to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be a horrible future if we're still writing the exact same code as we're writing today.
We figured it out. So do you guys see a future where people can use relay type semantics on the front end without having a relay backend? And by semantics, I don't mean necessarily the query language, but just like the ability to easily pass data into your components without, having to go through a bunch of setups.
Oh yeah, I totally think I know that the Relay team is actively working on that. I went to a meetup thing at Facebook a few weeks ago, and I was asking them about this exact question. I asked them the question I asked them first was, how has, Relay changed the way that you write Flux? Because I just assumed